Are Christians standing on good ground when they say that the tomb was in fact found empty on the third day?
No. The earliest and best evidence for the empty tomb comes from the four Gospels, which are about as historically reliable as a North Korean news anchor giving us an honest biography of Kim Jong-un. So, before you can convince me the tomb was empty, you first need to prove that these four religious fanfics, written by anonymous but die-hard believers trying to convince you their guy beat death, are actually reliable historical documents. If you manage to do that, congratulations to all of us, because we've officially all been baptized now.
Do you find that the empty tomb qualifies as part of the historical bedrock?
I don't.
Now that's the honesty we need.
I do think there's good reasons for it.
There are always good reasons to believe in anything, astrology, flat earth, and so on. The real question is, are those reasons good enough for anyone not already committed to the story? And apparently not. Even Gary Habermas, the resurrection guru himself, doesn't include the empty tomb in his minimal facts approach.
First, we'll look at the early attestation to the event. The empty tomb is mentioned in the resurrection accounts of all four Gospels.
So the story of the empty tomb comes from the exact same narrative where a man rises from the dead? What an astonishing coincidence. That's your proud source? Not only these aren't historical accounts in any meaningful sense, they're not even independent accounts. We know for a fact that Luke and Matthew copied heavily from Mark. John? Maybe he had access to the other three, or maybe he just decided to throw in some dramatic monologues and extra I am lines no one else had. Definitely more creative license than historical accuracy there. So this isn't four separate confirmations of the empty tomb. It's one religious community telling its origin story 4 times, with slightly different camera angles and more dramatic lighting as you go. What we're really seeing is a single literary tradition slowly evolving.
But this is where a concept called partial dependence needs to be fleshed out. Partial dependence refers to when a document is dependent on another source for some of their material, even if it's a large portion, but not all of their material. For example, when Matthew uses Mark as a source, even though it's for a large portion of his gospel, this does not mean that he is totally dependent upon Mark for all of his information.
Yes, the idea of partial dependence is valid, and most scholars would agree that Matthew didn't copy Mark exclusively. However, this actually hurts the case for independent eyewitness testimony, not helps it. If Matthew copies Mark for most of the structure and major events, including the empty tomb, then on that topic, he's not independent. Independence is judged per story or detail, not overall. Throwing in a few cinematic extras, like angels or earthquakes, doesn't magically make the core account independent. That's still literary expansion, not eyewitness corroboration. So, yes, he may be partially independent in a broad sense, but on the empty tomb specifically, his account is dependent. Think of it like this. If a student uses Wikipedia for 80% of their paper and adds 20% of their own thoughts, that doesn't make their paper an independent source of information on the topic.
And why should we believe that he's totally dependent upon Mark, especially if he is in fact Matthew and he was one of Jesus' disciples? We can say that Matthew himself can be an independent source.
That assumes 2 things that are both deeply problematic. First, that the Gospel of Matthew was actually written by the disciple Matthew. And second, that even if he were the author, his account reflects an independent eyewitness perspective. Let's unpack both. First, the Gospel of Matthew is anonymous. The name was slapped on later by church tradition. It was written in excellent Greek, shows deep familiarity with the Greek Septuagint, and copies the structure and content of Mark extensively. These aren't things we'd expect from a first-century Aramaic-speaking tax collector jotting down his personal memories from Galilee. Second, even if we entertain the idea that he was an eyewitness, why does his gospel include a story of a zombie parade randomly breaking out in Jerusalem after Jesus' death? That's not just absent from Mark. It's absent from every other gospel. Paul's letters, Acts, Josephus, and literally every known source from the time. If a mass resurrection event really happened, it's impossible to explain why only one source ever mentions it. And that source happens to be the most theologically dramatic of the 4. This suggests that Matthew wasn't calmly reporting what he saw. He was crafting a theological narrative. And when you mix that with how closely his resurrection narrative follows Mark, down to specific phrasing, it becomes really hard to argue that Matthew is some sort of independent historical witness.
And why would we also assume that he couldn't talk to other people? There's no reason to assume that Matthew is totally dependent upon Mark. In other words, we can say that he is partially dependent.
Sure, it's possible that Matthew talked to other people, But historical analysis isn't based on what's possible, it's based on what the evidence actually supports. And in this case, there's no sign of independent investigation. Matthew never says that he interviewed other witnesses, and there's zero internal or external evidence that suggests he did. No names, no sources, no "I was there," nothing. What is obvious is that he borrowed heavily from Mark. The structure, pacing, and even chunks of dialogue all scream, Mark was here first. It doesn't read like someone compiling first-hand testimonies. It reads like someone upgrading an earlier draft.
The reason we know the gospel authors are independent of one another for the resurrection passages is because they do not show signs of textual dependence. And there are prima facie tensions in the text. And what I mean by prima facie tensions is that if you read the narratives at face value, you will see some tensions in the text that need to be resolved, whether by literary devices or harmonization.
The idea that tensions equals independence only holds if you're assuming everyone is telling the truth from different angles. But if authors are modifying, inventing, or embellishing material, differences can arise for that reason too. Contradictions don't enhance credibility, they chip away at it. And the more effort apologists spend on harmonizing the contradictions, the clearer it becomes that these stories don't naturally align. If the stories fit together naturally, no harmonization would be needed.
Skeptics have argued for centuries that these tensions are irreconcilably contradictory. It's not within the scope of this video to show that these tensions are not in fact contradictions. However, I bring it up now because it serves as evidence of literary independence.
He's trying to have it both ways. Ignore the contradictions, but use them as evidence of independence. But if you're not willing to show that these tensions aren't actual contradictions, then you can't turn around and treat them as positive proof of literary independence. That's like saying, we won't explain why these eyewitnesses don't agree, but the fact that they don't must mean they're legit. No, that's not how credible evidence works. You can't wave away a problem and then point to it as proof. Also, those conflicting details could just as easily come from different authors making things up, fuzzy memory, reworking older material, or shaping the story to fit a theological agenda. All of these are historically plausible, and often more so than independent, reliable eyewitnesses. So unless you demonstrate that the contradictions arose because the authors were independently recalling real events, the claim has no foundation.
Historians also believe that the narrative of the empty tomb has historical plausibility because of the criterion of embarrassment. And you might be asking, what exactly is embarrassing about the discovery of the empty tomb? Jesus' disciples abandoned him. They were scattering. The Jesus movement was over. If it wasn't for the women going to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body on Sunday morning, who knows what would have happened with the Christian movement?
Okay, sure, that part is embarrassing, and I actually think it probably happened. What else would you expect from a group of cult followers after their leader gets arrested and executed? They ran. That's exactly what we'd expect in a high-pressure, life-threatening situation. So yes, the disciples fleeing sounds historically plausible. But how does that help your case for the empty tomb? Believing the disciples chickened out is one thing. That's human. That makes sense. But jumping from the disciples ran away to therefore the women definitely found an empty tomb is a leap across a canyon. That last bit.
If it wasn't for the women going to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body on Sunday morning, who knows what would have happened with the Christian movement?
I'm trying to follow the logic here, and I think the argument goes something like this. The only reason Christianity didn't die with Jesus is because the women discovered the empty tomb. That gives the story historical weight, because if it were fake, why hinge the entire movement on such an embarrassing, socially awkward scenario? Okay, but that's not actually evidence. More like an emotional storytelling than a historical analysis. It's like saying, the story, which already ends with the empty tomb and the resurrection being confirmed by men anyway, is so risky and awkward that no one would have made it up. Therefore, it must be true. But awkward stories get made up all the time, especially in religious origin myths. Just look around. Plenty of faiths have origin stories full of shame, failure, betrayal, or humiliation. That doesn't make them historical.
And on top of this, the testimony of women was not deemed as trustworthy in Jesus' day. And so why, if they were making up the story, would they say that women were the ones that discovered the tomb? This argument regarding the criterion of embarrassment has convinced a lot of historians and New Testament scholars that the narrative of the empty tomb is in fact a historical one.
By historians and New Testament scholars, he really means Christian apologists who've already bought into the resurrection package and have happily signed a statement of faith, which is basically the academic version of, I solemnly swear to believe this, no matter what, and I'm fully aware that questioning anything in the Bible is a quick way to get me kicked out.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
This is exactly where the criterion of embarrassment loses its credibility among serious, reliable scholars, because it's often rushed into service without careful scrutiny and mainly wielded as a convenient tool by Christian apologists eager to defend their faith narrative. Another limitation of this criterion is that determining what might have been embarrassing to the early church is also very difficult. This is due especially to the lack of detailed evidence for the thought of the early church, apart from that found in the New Testament. The idea that women's testimony wasn't trusted is overstated. I think what he meant is that it wasn't admissible in certain court settings, not that women were universally dismissed as unreliable by everyone, everywhere. But the gospel authors weren't writing legal briefs for skeptical Roman judges or Pharisaic courts. They were crafting stories for their own communities, believers and potential converts, which included women, lots of them, and those women could talk, share, teach, and inspire the other half of the population.
And this leads us to our second line of evidence for why we can affirm that the discovery of the empty tomb was a historical event. And it's that early opponents of Christianity presupposed the empty tomb in their objections to Christianity. We see our first and earliest glimpse of this in Matthew 28, where it says,
Are we seriously back to quoting Matthew like it's some neutral, reliable source? After everything we've already said? Come on, this is like trying to prove Bigfoot exists by quoting Bigfoot's autobiography. Matthew 28 doesn't give us what historians would call hostile sources. It gives us a scripted moment where the author puts convenient words into the mouths of the enemies to patch up a plot hole before the critics can poke at it. The Quran, for example, has Muhammad's opponents look at signs and say, magic. This is only evidence that Muhammad said they said that, nothing more. So no, early opponents of Christianity didn't presuppose the tomb was empty. What actually happened is Christian writers wrote down what they wished their opponents had said.
And when we look in the 2nd century, in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, in chapter 108, it says, A godless heresy had sprung up from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified. But his disciples stole him by night from the tomb, where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he is risen from the dead and ascended into heaven.
Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho is a 2nd century Christian apologetic work where Justin stages a fictional back and forth with a Jewish character named Trypho. Now, whether Trypho was a real person or just a literary puppet doesn't even matter, because either way, he's not an eyewitness. This is written about 100 years after the events it's pretending to comment on, and we have no clue where this supposed Jewish objection even came from. Maybe Justin heard it, maybe he made it up, no way to tell. So this isn't a Jewish source, it's Christian propaganda.
We can even see in later writings that this rumor persisted for centuries. In the 500s, in the Toledot Yeshu, it says, Diligent search was made, and he, Jesus, was not found in the grave where he had been buried. A gardener had taken him from the grave and had brought him into his garden and buried him in the sand over which the waters flowed into the garden.
Now we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel for historical evidence, aren't we? The Toledot Yeshu is a medieval Jewish parody text written many centuries after the time of Jesus. Think somewhere between the 6th and 10th century CE. And just like Christian apologists made up dialogues and rumors to defend their story, Jewish writers did the same to tear it down. Everyone had their own fan fiction. So, unless we're accepting every ancient parody as historical, let's not pretend this proves anything about an actual empty tomb in the 1st century.
So we have the early Christians attesting to the fact that the tomb was discovered empty on the 3rd day, and then we have the opponents of Christianity presupposing the empty tomb when they're arguing against Christianity.
Really sad.
But we're not done yet.
Oh my God.
We have a 3rd line of evidence, and I'm going to call this external corroboration. And for this, we're going to look to archaeology and the Nazareth inscription. This is an inscription that is typically dated to the first half of the 1st century, which says, You are absolutely not to allow anyone to move those who have been entombed. But if someone does, I wish that violator to suffer capital punishment under the title of tomb breaker. But notice how the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Why would there be a death penalty for moving someone's body from a tomb? Could it be because of the rumors that the Jewish people were spreading about Jesus' body being stolen? I think so.
This vague decree about tomb robbing doesn't mention Jesus, Christianity, crucifixions, or even Nazareth. It could be from anywhere in the Roman Empire, so this external evidence is just a random stone that might be related. In 2020, a peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science states, The stable isotope enrichment in carbon-13 and substantial depletion in oxygen, 18, provide a unique signature allowing the confident and unexpected identification of the upper quarry of the Greek island of Kos as the source of the marble. This information resolves a near century of debate among ancient historians about the significance of the inscription, hitherto most often connected with Roman reactions to early Christian reports of Jesus' empty tomb. So, where the heck does the Nazareth part come from then? Simple answer, we don't know. The tablet first appeared in 1878 when Wilhelm Frohner, a French antiquities collector, got his hands on it. He reportedly scribbled on a note that it came from Nazareth because that's what the dealer told him. That's it. No excavation, no site, no context. That's the entire reason it became known as the Nazareth inscription. Like many artifacts in Western collections, the Nazareth inscription was acquired before modern standards of archaeology and museum accessioning were established, and hence the true provenance of the Nazareth inscription and its route to Frohner in Paris in 1878 are unknown. So this external evidence is about as connected to Christianity as a rock you'd find in your backyard. Occam's razor suggests that the Edict of Caesar was prompted by an episode of tomb desecration on the very island where the marble was quarried. The Nazareth inscription should be seen not as a document of Rome's reaction to early Christianity. Rather, it reflects the efforts of the first emperor, Augustus, to establish law and order in the eastern Mediterranean in the years after he had defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. Now on that last question.
But notice how the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Why would there be a death penalty for moving someone's body from a tomb?
Well, if you understand context instead of preaching it, the answer is pretty straightforward. Around 30 BCE, the tomb of Nicias, the tyrant from Kos, was desecrated. It was a political stunt in a time of major upheaval. So Augustus, busy trying to pull the empire together after the mess of civil war, laid down the law, hard. In that context, the harsh punishment does fit. It is proposed that the edict was issued by Caesar Augustus in response to the desecration of the grave of a famous tyrant from Kos named Nicias, a theory which more logically fits with the provenance of the marble and the events of that time.
Now, with these 3 lines of independent evidence for the empty tomb narratives being historical ones, why would anyone doubt their historicity?
Let's recap. We've got the Bible, a 2nd century church father writing a made-up debate with a possibly made-up guy, a book from around the 9th century, and finally, a random stone inscription that doesn't mention Jesus, Christianity, or anything remotely relevant. So yeah, why would anyone doubt the historicity of the empty tomb? Totally airtight.
Well, there's one more major objection I want to get to, and it's this. The regular practice for crucifixion in the Roman Empire outside of Judea at the time of Jesus was to have the crucifixion victims either rot or be eaten by animals on the cross and then be thrown into a mass grave. Or if the Jewish people did take them off the cross, they would be buried somewhere in private. And so no one would have known where Jesus was buried. So, the skeptics say, the burden of proof is on us to show that in Judea, the practice was different for the burial and the empty tomb narratives to be considered historical.
If you had actual evidence of a tomb, I'd be willing to say, okay, maybe this guy got special treatment. Exceptions happen. But at the end of the day, none of this hinges on tomb logistics. You either trust the Gospels or you don't. If you do, you're already a believer. If you don't, then this whole empty tomb thing is just ancient group chat lore written by people who really wanted the story to end well. I'll tell you what, let's play your game. I'll grant you everything. Jesus believed he was the Messiah. His followers believed it too. He was crucified, buried in a nice tomb, and on the 3rd day, some women went there and found it empty. Fine, let's grant all of that as historical fact. So what? Does that mean a man literally came back from the dead? Absolutely not. Here's a completely naturalistic explanation that fits just as well, maybe even better because it doesn't require magic. The Romans stole the body. Why? Strategy. Rome was constantly dealing with Jewish rebellions. Here comes this tiny cult saying, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and turn the other cheek. Peaceful, non-violent. Rome loved that. Meanwhile, the rest of the Jews were waiting for a Messiah who would overthrow Rome. That's a nightmare for the empire. So what do? You remove the dead Messiah's body and let the resurrection rumor spread. Boom. Christianity grows at the expense of the other Jews, and now you've got division instead of unity. Civil war among the Jews instead of a united rebellion against Rome. Genius. And within a few decades, the trail goes cold. The evidence is gone, vanished. All we have left are letters and gospels written in Greek, the language of the empire, not Hebrew. That's the paper trail. So now, 2,000 years later, apologists look at this and tell us the only plausible explanation is a resurrection. Really? The literal magic option is more likely than political manipulation? Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.